3 months after Helen passed, the silence of our home became unbearable. Every room echoed with memories of laughter and whispered secrets, every corner a reminder of a life that was no more. So, when Brian, a friend of a friend, mentioned he was looking for a roommate, I didn't hesitate. It seemed like the perfect escape from the constant, suffocating grief. Brian lived in an old Victorian house on the edge of town. It was a bit run down, with peeling paint and a front porch that creaked ominously underfoot, but it had character. I told myself it was a fresh start. During the day, the house was charming, sunbeams revealing dancing dust motes in the quiet air. But at night, it transformed, shadows stretching like fingers along the corridors, the wind moaning through cracks that time had etched into the walls. Brian was a peculiar character, his demeanor as weathered as the house. He was polite, yet there was a distance in his eyes, a barrier I could never breach. We shared the occasional beer in the evening, small talk filling the spaces between us. But as days bled into weeks, I noticed oddities that I couldn't ignore. It started with noises in the night, thumps and scrapes that didn't belong in the stillness. When I mentioned them, Brian would just shrug, a flicker of something unrecognizable crossing his features. "Old houses make old sounds," he'd say, his tone dismissive. Then, there were the locked doors. The basement, the attic, and one room on the second floor were always locked. When curiosity got the better of me one day, Brian's explanation was curt. "Storage," he said, his eyes not meeting mine. "Just old junk no one needs to see." But it was the basement that drew me. Some nights, I'd hear sounds, like muffled cries, seeping through the ceiling below my room. The first few times, I convinced myself it was just the house settling, or the wind. But one night, the sound was unmistakable, the soft, desperate sobbing of a woman. I confronted Brian the next morning. His reaction was explosive, anger flaring in his eyes. "You're hearing things, man. Just like you see things that aren't there." His outburst left me shaken, and for the first time, I felt a surge of real fear. Not of the house, but of the man living in it. My fear solidified into resolve. That night, when Brian was out, likely at one of his frequent late-night bar visits, I found the key to the basement hidden in a kitchen drawer, tucked beneath an old, stained cookbook. My hands shook as I slid the key into the lock, the metallic click too loud in the silent house. Descending the stairs, the air grew colder, damper. At the bottom, I fumbled for a switch and dim bulbs flickered to life, casting a sickly glow over the concrete floor. The room was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, but it was the far corner that caught my attention. Chains. Bolted to the wall were rusted chains, and on the floor, a thin mattress stained with dark spots that my mind refused to identify. My stomach churned as I approached, every instinct screaming to turn and run. And then I saw it, a small, tattered photo lying near the mattress. It was a picture of Helen, my Helen, smiling up at me, her eyes crinkling at the edges just as I remembered. My heart stopped. The sobbing I'd heard wasn't the house, wasn't my imagination. It was her, my wife, or her memory, haunting the darkness of this terrible place. I heard footsteps above me, heavy and hurried. Brian had returned. Panicking, I turned to leave, but it was too late. The basement door slammed shut, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing off the concrete walls. I was trapped, the photo of Helen clutched in my fist as I faced the darkest truth of all. Brian hadn't found me by chance. This wasn't about a roommate helping another out, it was about something far more sinister. Days passed, or maybe weeks, it's hard to tell now. I'm still in the basement, the dim light bulb my only company. Sometimes, I think I hear Helen's voice, whispering through the darkness, telling me it's going to be okay, that I'm not alone. I cling to her voice, a lifeline in the suffocating shadows. I don't know if I'll ever escape, if I'll ever feel the sun on my face again. But I know one thing, the house is haunted, not by ghosts, but by memories and by something far worse, by a man who wears the mask of friendliness, whose heart is as dark and twisted as the corridors of his sinister home. If you ever hear of a room for rent in an old Victorian at the edge of town, keep driving, and don't look back. Not all hauntings are made of spirits, some are made of flesh and blood, and those are the most terrifying of all. When I first posted the ad for a roommate, it was out of sheer financial desperation. My tiny apartment in the city was bleeding me dry, and with the cost of living climbing steadily, finding someone to share the burden seemed like my only option. That's how I met Melissa. She responded to my online ad with enthusiasm that bordered on eager. Her messages were punctuated with cheerful emoticons and exclamation points. We exchanged emails, and eventually, phone calls, discussing everything from decor preferences to work schedules. She seemed perfect, responsible, friendly, and tidy. We agreed to meet at a local cafe, and when I saw her, nothing seemed amiss. She was petite, with an infectious smile and an easy laugh. Moving day arrived shortly after, and Melissa brought little with her, just a few boxes and suitcases. I prefer to live minimally, she explained, tucking her hair behind her ear with a shy smile. I admired that. My life was cluttered with too much stuff from years of living in the same place. The first few weeks were blissfully uneventful. Melissa was as good a roommate as her messages had promised. She cleaned up after herself, always paid her share of the bills on time, and respected my privacy. It was everything I had hoped for. But soon, odd things began to happen. It started with the mirrors. I came home one evening to find every mirror in the apartment covered with drapes or turned to face the wall. I stood in the hallway, my keys dangling from my fingers, as a cold unease trickled down my spine. "Melissa?" I called out, moving cautiously into the living room. "What happened here?" She emerged from her room, her smile a little too wide. "Oh, I'm sorry. I should have asked, but I find mirrors a bit unsettling. Bad energy, you know." Her laughter rang hollow in the draped room. I nodded, not wanting to upset her over something seemingly trivial, though it struck me as odd. "Could we maybe just cover the ones in your room?" I suggested, and reluctantly, she agreed. But that was only the beginning. Food in the fridge began to rot at an alarming rate. Items that were fresh one day were spoiled the next. A putrid smell lingered no matter how much I cleaned. Melissa only shrugged when I brought it up, her eyes distant. "Bad energy," she repeated, a phrase that had become her mantra for every unexplainable incident. Then there were the nights. Melissa had said she was a night owl, but I didn't realize what that meant until I found her more than once standing in the living room in the dead of night, completely still, her eyes fixed on some distant point. The first time it happened, I called her name, and she didn't respond until the third or fourth shout. When she turned to look at me, her eyes were empty, soulless. "Just thinking," she'd say, her voice flat, and then she'd go back to her room as if nothing had happened. Sleep became elusive for me after that. I would lie in bed listening for any sound, the silence of the apartment heavy with my own dread. One evening, things escalated. I came home late from work to find the apartment dark, the air stale with a sickly sweet odor. Flicking the lights on, I almost screamed. Words were smeared on the walls with what looked like red paint but was dark and too thick. "CME," the message read in an erratic, jagged scrawl that made my heart race. "Melissa!" I shouted, panic seizing my throat as I rushed to her room. The door was ajar, and inside, Melissa was nowhere to be found. But on her bed was another message, this one laid out in what unmistakably looked like blood. "Can you see me now?" I stumbled backward, my mind racing with horror. This had to be a nightmare. It just had to be. But the sticky warmth on my hands as I braced myself against the doorframe was grotesquely real. I ran then, out of the apartment, down the stairs, not stopping until I was out on the street, my breath's ragged sobs of terror. From a payphone, I called the police, my words a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. When the police arrived, I led them back to the apartment, my hands still trembling. But as we entered, my confusion deepened into a cold, sinking dread. The walls were clean. Melissa's room was tidy, untouched. No cryptic messages, no signs of any disturbance. But I saw it. I murmured, my voice trailing off as the officers exchanged looks that clearly labeled me as hysterical or worse. "Miss, are you sure you're okay? Maybe you just need some rest," one of them suggested gently, but his eyes said clearly that he thought I was unhinged. Melissa appeared the next day, her demeanor breezy as if she'd just returned from a refreshing walk. "Hey, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," she chuckled, brushing off my questions about the night before as if they were part of a distant dream. But I couldn't let it go. The terror was too sharp, too real. I moved out shortly thereafter, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the apartment and Melissa's strange behavior. The thrill of moving into our first apartment was something Marissa and I had dreamt about since our freshman year at college. No more dorm rules, no more sharing bathrooms with an entire floor, just freedom, late-night pizza sessions, and decorating our space exactly how we wanted. When we finally signed the lease for a quaint, slightly aged two-bedroom on the edge of town, it felt like the beginning of a new, exciting chapter. The apartment complex was older, nestled against a backdrop of dense woods, giving it a secluded, almost secretive feel. It had its quirks, creaky floorboards, drafty windows, but it had character, and most importantly, it was ours. The weekend Marissa left to visit her family, I experienced my first taste of true independence. I waved her off, secretly eager to enjoy some alone time. The first night alone was blissful. I sprawled across the living room with junk food and a horror movie marathon. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on the second day, the solitude I'd relished began to morph into an unsettling quiet that prickled the back of my neck. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the typical jitters of staying alone. That night, after double-checking the locks on the doors and windows, I retreated to my room, the comforting hum of the TV a soft echo behind me. I was just about to drift off when a noise snapped me to attention, a soft thump, like something had been dropped, coming from Marissa's room. Frozen, I listened, holding my breath. Rational thoughts battled with the growing dread. Maybe Marissa had come back early, or perhaps I hadn't secured a window, and the wind was playing tricks. But another sound, a barely perceptible scrape, like a chair being dragged across the floor, propelled me out of bed. Heart hammering, I crept to my bedroom door, ears straining for any more sounds. The apartment was silent now, the earlier noise perhaps just a figment of my imagination fueled by too many horror movies. I reached for the baseball bat we kept for just-in-case scenarios, my fingers trembling as I grasped it firmly. Swallowing my fear, I tiptoed across the living room to Marissa's door. It was ajar, odd since Marissa was meticulous about closing it before leaving. I nudged the door open with the tip of the bat, the old hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The room was bathed in moonlight, casting long, ominous shadows across the floor. Everything seemed normal at first glance, until my eyes adjusted to the dark, and I saw the closet door. It was open, just a crack, something Marissa never did. My mind screamed to run, to lock myself in my room and call the police, but I needed to know. Edging closer, I positioned myself by the side of the closet, bat raised, ready to defend myself. I counted to 3 under my breath and then yanked the door open. For a moment, I could only process bits and pieces. A figure, curled up in the corner of the closet. Blankets stolen from the linen closet. Food wrappers from our kitchen. Then, as the figure stirred, lifting a head obscured by tangled, dirty hair, my terror cemented into reality. Eyes, wide and wild, stared back at me. A man, a stranger, had been living in Marissa's closet. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the apartment. The man lunged, his movements desperate and erratic. I swung the bat with all my might, catching him on the shoulder. He staggered back, pain and surprise flashing across his features, and I took my chance to run. I bolted to the front door, fumbling with the locks in a frantic rush to escape. I burst out into the cool night air, the complex eerily quiet around me. My mind raced as I dialed 911, the operator's calm voice a stark contrast to my panicked sobs. The police arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. They searched the apartment, finding the man still in Marissa's room, nursing his shoulder. He was arrested without further incident, but the questions that followed were almost as harrowing as the discovery itself. He had been there for days, sneaking in through a faulty window we had overlooked. He watched, he listened, and when the opportunity arose, he hid. The thought of sharing our home with a stranger, unseen yet so close, sent shivers down my spine. Marissa returned the next day, her face pale as I recounted the ordeal. The apartment no longer felt like ours, the shadows too deep, every creak a reminder of the weekend's terror. We broke the lease, unable to stomach the thought of staying a moment longer. We moved in with a friend until we found a new place, the lessons learned haunting us long after our boxes were unpacked. Trust in our safety was shattered, replaced by a vigilance that bordered on paranoia.